So maybe I'll just invite Adele to come in and introduce herself, and then I'll continue with the intro as well from there.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present with Jacques today. So I'm from UNISA. UNISA is a university in South Africa, and we've got a few campuses in South Africa. So I'm from the campus in Johannesburg. Our main campus is in Pretoria. So we have about over 400,000 students, and we've had quite an interesting time now with COVID, getting all 400,000 students to write online. So we're still processing our marks, and it's going well. I think the university has done well, but it's been a challenging time for the university. So it's actually nice now to be engaged in a conference online, just to forget a bit about the tuition for a while. So thank you, Jacques. Going to start the presentation, and I'll fill in as we go along.
Thank you, Adele. Yes, so my name is Jacques Ophoff. I've been at the University of Cape Town since 2012, but left there at the end of last year. And I've now joined the University of Adele in Dundee. Just made it in before COVID-19 started locking everything down. And so, yes, our talk is not about COVID-19, but it does continue the theme of privacy, and probably sort of connects very nicely to the previous presentation. So I'll continue. So in terms of information privacy, obviously there's quite a few different perspectives being investigated. For example, just a couple could be from the organizational perspective. People often look at compliance with data protection laws, what the organization needs to consider, for example, how something like a data breach is handled, which could obviously impact the organization, but also its consumers. And then obviously there's a lot of research on individual expectations of privacy, which is where we connected our research. So we are sort of in this area where we sort of put forward this idea that individuals have different levels of privacy concern, which is based on their expectation for privacy, but also their perception of how well organizations are managing the data that they hold. When we talk about privacy expectations, obviously there's also many factors that can influence something like this. For example, research has shown that gender, age, nationality could influence your expectations. Your culture could as well. Even experiences of recent data breaches could influence your expectation for privacy. There's also studies which show that across different countries, this is different. So for example, expectations are lower in the United States compared to Europe and the UK. And sometimes women are more concerned about privacy than men. And even within the same jurisdiction, expectations could vary. What is interesting is that there seems to be a growing disconnect between what consumers are expecting and what they perceive organizations are actually delivering in terms of protecting their data. And so our main sort of question was just, do we actually understand what the individual's privacy expectations are and how much confidence they have in organizations meeting those expectations?
So the aim of our paper was to look at the individual privacy expectations and how that would align to their confidence that organizations are meeting their expectations. So if the expectations and the confidence do not align, one would expect to see a gap. And that could then influence the trust that the individuals have, as well as raise some concern for information privacy. So we did the study in South Africa and the United Kingdom. And for each of these countries, we looked at the privacy expectations and how that would compare to their confidence in the expectations, and then comparing both of those of South Africa to the UK. At the same time, it also gives one an indication of whether there's a perception that companies comply with data protection requirements. So all three of those sub-aspects were then considered together with the overall aim. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the concept of concern for information privacy, it's been studied since the 1990s with Western, and it really focuses on individuals' concerns about the practices that responsible parties, or in some legislation they refer to the data controller, how they process personal information. And it's not only about the security and the privacy, but also what these responsible parties do with the data, how they handle it and the usage of that. And the personal information could then be the names, the surnames, the identity numbers, now very relevant, the health data, and how online organizations, the banks, hospitals, universities, what they do with the information. So what we often find then is that individuals have expectations in terms of how they expect these responsible parties to process their data. And it's interesting, their expectations could be higher than what is the minimum requirements of the law, or it could be lower depending on their cultural or their demographic profile. But it could result in some risk that they could perceive due to negative consequences that have occurred to their personal information in the past or breaches. But in the end, they would have some sort of concern for their information privacy. So Stewart and Smith, Western, there's been a number of researchers in the past who developed surveys and questions to measure the concern for information privacy. They've extended it to the internet. And if you look at their questionnaires, they've got a mix of questions. Some of these questionnaires are quite short, but they partly focus on expectations, and some of their questions partly focus on the confidence as to whether an individual feels that an organization or government is meeting some privacy regulatory requirement. So what we've chosen as an instrument in this study was the Online Information Privacy Culture Index. So this questionnaire has a set of questions focusing specifically on expectations, and then a corresponding set of questions focusing on the confidence, all of these then mapping to regulatory requirements, in the end then to measure the concern for information privacy.
Right, so effectively sort of managing concern for privacy is very important. And so we briefly in this slide just look at the legislation that's available both in South Africa and in the UK. If we start with the UK, the Data Protection Act has been in force for a very long time, since 1984. And it was one of the world's first measures to protect people's personal information. And so it's been revised over the years. In its current format, it's also closely aligned with the GDPR, and it has modernized data protection laws in the UK to also be relevant in an online world. So quite established, stable environment. On the other hand, South Africa is probably considered to be lagging behind, especially in terms of online processing of your personal information. And what South Africa has enacted a few years ago is the Protection of Personal Information Act. And I believe just in the last few weeks, this has now been set to come into force next year. So there will finally be some, I think, scrambling to get this integrated into organizations. However, one can say that the POPI Act, as it's known, incorporates some of the most effective elements from global privacy laws, and it's also drawing a lot of parallels with GDPR. So also a very promising step towards putting effective legislation in place.
So just to give you a quick overview of the instrument, there is another paper published with the details of it, but it comprises of 11 constructs, and they are listed there on the screen. You'll see, for example, accountability, openness, processing or use limitation. So all of these map to the FIPS principles. And then it's also, we mapped it to the UK Data Protection Act and to POPI. So the questionnaire comprises of these 11 constructs. It starts off with a biographical information section where we obtain information about both countries, and then a general information privacy concern section with questions asking, for example, have you experienced a data breach of your personal information? How concerned are you with sharing information online, etc. So for the 11 constructs, we've created, or the questionnaire comprises of 2 sets of questions. The one would be the privacy expectation set, and the other one, the privacy confidence set. So for each of those constructs, for example, accountability, there will be a set of privacy expectation and corresponding privacy confidence questions. So if you look at the first little example there, question 31, I expect online companies or websites to notify me before they start collecting my personal information. So this is the expectation of the individual. It could be higher or lower than the regulatory requirement, but the regulatory requirement would be that companies need to notify you before they start collecting information. On the confidence side, the question asks whether they are confident that companies indeed notify them, and then identifying the gap in the expectation confidence, as well as then simultaneously if there's a perception that companies are complying with the regulatory requirements.
So we collected data using an online survey, which was distributed electronically both in South Africa through a market research company, as well as in the UK through Prolific. Overall, almost 1,500 responses were collected across the 2 countries. And we're fairly happy with the representation that we received. In the UK, the sample was slightly more female dominated. In South Africa, it was relatively balanced. Different demographic groups were also fairly representative as well. And in both countries, individuals mostly stated that they go online for fairly similar purposes. For example, browsing the web, email, social media, online banking. And both countries' respondents also indicated that they provide personal information mostly in relation to purchasing a product or in terms of social media use. So that was very interesting to see the similarities there.
So after we've collected the data, we did some analysis in SPSS, and we compared the South African and UK data. So this is a summary of the means of the data. So you'll see that the first 2 bars represent South Africa, and the 4.43 mean relates to the expectations of the respondents. So one can see that the expectations for privacy is very high. For South Africa and the UK, for the UK it's 4.45. So both countries, the respondents have a very high expectation for privacy in terms of all 11 constructs. So that would be for all the privacy regulatory requirements of which the questionnaire comprises. Unfortunately, the confidence in whether companies are meeting those expectations, as well as in the regulatory requirement, is low. So it shows that there is a gap then. In the UK, the gap is higher, which is interesting because one might have presumed that in the UK, the gap will be smaller because the law has been in place for much longer. And it might be, and we looked at this, and a possible reason could be that South Africans might not be as aware of their privacy rights as in the UK. As Jacques said, only last week, the president announced that the POPI Act will be commencing, and companies now have 1 year to comply, and next year, July, they all have to be in compliance. So it might be that the data could look different once companies are forced to now comply with this piece of legislation and the regulator can actively start monitoring. But it is then interesting to see that there's a trend that corresponds for South Africa and the UK, where there's a high expectation, but consumers are concerned that their expectations are not met.
So we looked at some of the privacy principles in a little more detail, and this slide sort of summarizes the main takeaways. There's obviously some nice extra detail in the paper itself. So first, very interesting point to note is that the majority of expectations, both for the UK and South Africa, were above a mean of 4, which means people mostly expected these things. And only 2 statements were actually lower. The first was related to the expectation to keep personal information updated. And the second was related to whether respondents know where to submit a complaint if they believe the company did not protect their personal information. If we then look at what people had the highest expectations of, it was interesting. The top 3 for both countries differed. So in South Africa, the very top expectation was that online companies would only use personal information for the purposes agreed for. Whereas in the UK, the expectation was that people would be able to correct or delete personal information upon request. If one then looked at the flip side in terms of confidence and what companies or what people had the lowest confidence in South Africa, the lowest means were related to the confidence that online companies are informing one if personal information was lost, damaged, or exposed publicly. So the statement which came up the lowest was that one shown on the slide. In the UK, the people were more negative in terms of whether online companies are meeting privacy requirements and expectations in practice. And so there, the lowest confidence was in whether online companies are only using your personal information for the purposes agreed to. So very interesting differences between the countries if one looks at individual privacy principles.
Then further on with the country differences, if we looked at the confidence versus expectation item pairs on a statement by statement level, for both South Africa and the UK, all the statements had a significant difference. So we did a t-test and it was significant for both countries in terms of the question pairs. There were 30 items with a significant difference between the UK and SA data. So in South Africa, 22 of the confidence statements were more positive than the UK, which means that South Africans felt a little bit more positive in terms of the UK as to whether online companies are meeting their privacy expectations. Then secondly, South Africa were more confident than the UK that the data privacy requirements are implemented. So this could change now that POPI will come into effect when consumers start to become more aware of what their rights and privacy is and how companies will be prosecuted if the regulator is active. And we can monitor this over time. But both countries felt that companies are not taking their responsibility serious to protect personal information. The UK, only 31% were confident, and in South Africa, 39% were confident that companies are serious about protecting their personal information.
So in summary, the expectation for privacy was very high in both countries, as we saw. And one of the main differences was that in the UK, respondents are more concerned that online companies are not meeting these expectations. However, there seems to be a gap in terms of the expectations compared to the confidence in whether organizations are meeting this. And so there's very interesting further research that could be done. Also, we must just note that our focus was on organizations, and of course, the same type of study could be aimed at government, as in the first presentation, on whether the expectation and confidence in government is there and what the status there is. And so we don't claim to have looked at that specifically. But obviously, yeah, very interesting from our perspective, and we look forward to any questions or comments on this work. Thank you very much.